So I was thinking to myself, why don't I do something super original for this video and rank all 7 of Arctic Monkeys' albums from worst to best? Because that's never been done before. But with the card being out for more than a few months now, it just feels like a good time to do it. Just a preface before we begin though. In case you didn't notice, if you've been watching my channel for the past couple of weeks now, Arctic Monkeys are my favourite band. So making a video about ranking their material is not ideal for me. I almost feel like I'm playing some sort of sick joke on myself here. And, you know, I'd like to think that I would treat Arctic Monkeys albums like I'd treat my children if I had children. I could just never pick a favourite, you know? I love them all equally and for very different reasons. But I couldn't think of another content idea for this week, so we're doing it. Let's begin. Okay, so in 7th place, last but by no means least, it's Arctic Monkeys' latest album, The Car. Now, if you haven't yet seen my full in-depth review of that album, I'll put a link up at the top of the screen somewhere so you can check that out. But to briefly summarise in this video though, although Arctic Monkeys' latest album does contain some of the best work the band have ever done, with standout tracks like There'd Better Be a Mirable and Body Pain, as a listen from start to finish, it still just leaves a lot to be desired in my opinion. And I feel as though the album as a whole just doesn't give the listener as many memorable moments as their previous albums have done. And when you compare it to the album that came before it that set them off on this journey in search of this new sonic destination, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, The Car just has a weaker overall theme and narrative running throughout it. It's just a much less interesting and well thought out concept, and it kind of feels like it was cobbled together or almost put together by accident. And the result is just much less of a thrilling journey, both in terms of imagery and sound. Tranquility Base, to many fans, was considered an absolute masterpiece, and to be honest, I can completely understand how that opinion was formed and where that's coming from. I mean, to think up and document a dystopian future that runs deep with observations about our current, confusing and somewhat worrying reality, and do this through a seismic shift in sound from rockabilly to lounge jazz effectively, and pull it off in the way that the band did is pretty extraordinary in one album cycle. But to give The Car the same label of masterpiece, well, I think it's just hyperbole, to be honest. The album also feels a bit forced for me. Everything sounds just a bit too calculated, a bit too perfect, and it kind of lacks in the charm and the warmth of their previous work that kind of made me fall in love with the band in the first place. I guess, in summary, there's little on the album that would want to make me revisit this one again and again and again. It's lacking in memorable singles, but it's also just lacking in memorable moments for me. And so it's bottom of the list for me personally, but do let me know in the comments down below whether you agree with my rankings or not, and if you'd have picked a different order and why. Now, in 6th place is the album that I feel is the least talked about album from the Monkeys, and it's probably the most underrated one as well. Suck It and See, the band's 5th studio album, saw the band return to a live recording format, with all 4 members in a single room writing and working out songs together and then recording them live. Something that the band hadn't done since album 1, by the way. And the result for me is an album with just such charm and warmth that sounds like a rock band, and one that gives that familiarity that the listener is yearning for when they want to listen to the Arctic Monkeys. The album just has a bright and warm sound that sounds like summer, and it just makes you want to revisit the album again and again. It's also just a really easy listen with great melody and great songwriting throughout it. But the album is sort of an album of 2 halves in a way. And the A-side, if we're calling it that, contains the singles from the album, in other words the songs that we heard first that were supposed to be representative of the full album, and it turns out they just weren't. For example, releasing Brick by Brick as the first taster of the album was just a really strange move for me, and I can't help but think that maybe that put some fans off, or maybe disguise some of the genius deeper cuts of the album like Love is a Laser Quest or Piledriver Waltz. Although the album is an album of 2 halves, those halves work beautifully together. In the first half of the album, you've got the thunderous Don't Sit Down Cause I Moved Your Chair, and on the second half of the album, you've got what can only be described as some of the most well-constructed and beautifully written songs that the band have ever written. And of course, how could I mention this album without mentioning the name? One thing that's very interesting here is that the band definitely did take on their own advice with the subsequent releases after this one, especially on these next few. So in 5th place, I've gone for the band's 3rd studio album, Humbug. Now, the band took a short hiatus between album 2, Favourite Worst Nightmare, and album 3, Humbug, and Alex did his thing with the last Shadow Puppets. And I can't help but think that experience influenced directly what AM3 was going to sound like. He even said in an interview at the time that, quote, he wanted to get a bit weird with the band's sound. So naturally, the band gave Josh Homme, Queens of the Stone Age frontman, a call and set off to the desert to record what can only be described as an album that no one saw coming. Now, apart from stating the obvious here and describing it as a fan favourite, which it obviously is, the album showcased a massive step up in musicianship from each member of the band. Super unconventional and sometimes haunting guitar scales and sounds, thunderous and imaginative drum patterns, and an overall darker aesthetic. One that was a complete juxtaposition from the band's light-hearted and humour-clad earlier work. And it's also the first album in which you could argue that Alex Turner actually starts to sing instead of shout. This was definitely a big turning point in the band's overall trajectory. Even the lyrics on this one became much less observational and much more poetic and metaphorical, a style that Alex Turner would return to on Tranquility Base and The Car. The album contains the best ballad the band have ever written, Cornerstone, and some of the most heavy and chaotic moments that the band have ever produced, like on Pretty Visitors. There are even art rock kind of moments on the album, like on The Jeweler's Hands, the closer. It's just a very layered album, rich in interesting tones, sounds, and concepts. And it's a closely guarded favourite amongst hardcore AM fans. Truly great album. Okay, so in at number 4 is probably the band's most divisive album to date, Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino. Now, before you dismiss this ranking altogether, or decide to skip this section, hear me out. You can't argue with the fact that this album contains some of the band's most thoughtful and considered work ever. Trigger warning, a bit of mansplaining is about to ensue. So take pop music today, right, or indie pop music. It's really kind of quite surface level when you think about it. There's not really much to it, i.e. you listen to the song a few times, it gives you that dopamine hit that you've been chasing, but then after that, because there's not really much to dig into beyond that point on that song, you kind of just dispose of it and then go in search of that next dopamine hit. This album is the polar opposite of that. If modern day pop songs are a McDonald's cheeseburger, then this album is like a fine wine that's been aged for 30 years. And the longer you leave it, the sweeter, deeper, and more complex the flavour profile gets. Littered with hidden meanings, clever and layered instrumentation, and references to pop culture and science fiction novels, George Orwell being one of many, for example. Creatively, this work is just in a league of its own. And I'm finding that I'm still learning more things about the album, even now, 4 years on. However, and there is a however, as an album from start to finish, I can't help but think that some of the songwriting or musical aspects of the album could be stronger in places. After all, if it's clever, intelligent, and a little bit out there and quite creative, then great. But at the same time, it has to be an enjoyable listen. And just like The Car, I can't help but think this album is lacking in those memorable moments. I was kind of hoping for more moments like 4 out of 5, for example. But that's it really as far as where this album falls down for me. Now, I can't for the life of me go into all the details on this album, it would just take me hours. So I'll put a link at the top of the screen to a video from a different channel which in my opinion breaks down the meaning behind Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino perfectly. And if you have yet to dig deep on this album, it's going to blow your mind, trust me. Okay, so in at 3rd place, Favourite Worst Nightmare. It's just a masterpiece, but it's a masterpiece in a completely different way to Tranquility Base. And for several fans, it's in many ways regarded as just the perfect indie pop rock album. And the interesting thing about this album is actually that it was the second album that the band released. Now, usually when a band releases their sophomore album, you'd expect to see a drop-off in the quality of the songs. Usually the band are under time pressure to follow up on their initial success, and the songs that didn't make it onto the first album usually end up making up the majority of album 2, but not with the Arctic Monkeys. The band even said in an interview at the time that they were under time pressure to complete the album, and it wasn't actually completed to their desired standard. Well, I've got to say, I'm not really sure what they're talking about here because it's hard for me to imagine a better album than this one. On this album, heavy sounds got heavier, like on Brainstorm, and the softer, sweeter sounds got even sweeter, on songs like Only One to Know, with a more refined sound overall than album 1, and clever, funny lyrics again that give tough competition to those on album 1 also. It's just a modern day classic for me. Oh, and not to mention as well that the album contains the song 505, one of the band's best songs of all time that's even a TikTok trend right now, whatever that means. Now, deciding which of these remaining 2 albums should go first and second has honestly been one of the most challenging decisions I've ever had to make in my life. Now, I'll be honest, I kind of keep flip-flopping between these 2. Let me know in the comments which one you guys would have chosen as your number 1 and number 2 respectively. I've decided, however, after much deliberation, that the band's debut album, whatever people say I am, that's what I'm not, is going to take the number 2 spot. Now, I remember when I first heard this album at the ripe old age of about 12. Now, at this time, I was kind of just getting into music, and I was into hip-hop and rap, to be honest. Eminem, Curtain Call, and all that good stuff. And I hadn't really gained an affinity or an appreciation yet for guitar-based music. I had heard indie rock music, of course, up to this point, but nothing like this. This album single-handedly changed the game for me. And when I heard it for the first time, I was like, what is this? It was just like nothing I'd ever heard. Unbelievable, Jeff.
It's unbelievable, Jeff!
The sound of the album just had such charm. Excuse the cliche here, but it was just so real and inspiring. Like, it was just not plastic. It was like the polar opposite of like pop plastic artists, which were quite big at the time. 4 lads making music in a garage about the troubles of coming of age with that level of humour, awareness and riff-tasticness and intelligence. My god, just a recipe for a fantastic album. I just wanted to be them. For me, it's probably the best debut album of all time of any band. Every song is just a work of art, perfectly executed. All of them could be singles. And the album just takes you on this amazing sonic journey, and there's never a dull moment. And if it wasn't for this next album, it'd be number 1. So, in first place, of course, it was the band's rare second coming. You just don't see a band rise to superstardom with their debut album and then do it all again 4 albums later. This album is just a perfect album, in my opinion. And I would genuinely hang it up there on the wall, in and amongst Oasis's Definitely Maybe, Ziggy Stardust, Led Zeppelin 4, Michael Jackson, Thriller, just to name a few. And yes, I'm comparing it to Thriller, but hear me out. Just like Thriller, there are no skips on this album. It's just bop after bop from start to finish. And the reason it's number 1 for me is because we're talking about the album format here. And as an album, when you listen to it from start to finish, it just makes complete sense in every which way you think about it. It starts with the most perfect opener in Do I Wanna Know. The band still sometimes open with that song live, nearly 10 years later. That's how good of an opener that track is. And it ends in the most perfect way with this melancholic ballad of I Wanna Be Yours. The narrative throughout the album just tells the perfect story, and it resolves in the most satisfying way too. You know, for example, the cyclical nature of Are You Mine near the start of the album, and then resolving with I Wanna Be Yours. And the album takes what we can describe as a fairly oversubscribed concept in the music world of romantic relationships, and somehow manages to put a different spin on it. Whenever you listen to AM, the lyrics just sound so fresh, inspiring, intelligent and witty, and just different from anything else out there. And of course, the most important thing about a song or an album is that it gets you there all the way through. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, the production on this album from start to finish is just perfect, almost jigsaw-like. No sound is out of place, and it's just been mixed perfectly. 10 years on, it still sounds like it could be released today. Next year will be a full decade since AM's been released, and safe to say the album has transcended a generation, and I'm pretty sure it's still in the charts, isn't it? What more is there to say, really? An absolute banger, and I'm sure in 50 years people will still be talking about this album. So that's it, my ranking of all 7 Arctic Monkeys albums from worst to best. Do hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this, and smash that like button because it really helps smaller channels like mine out. Now, before you go, I really do want to know what the consensus is here. Let me know in the comments below if you'd have selected a different ranking or a different order and why. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.